Welcome everyone to another episode of the Atomic Podcast, where we look at sort of cross pollination of technology, but also ideas that I think are really important to our moment in time, across AI, across quantum, across the neurosciences, across really our human life and experiences. And today I'm very, very excited to really be talking to two, I think, leaders uh, in the field of consciousness studies. Nicco, first of all, I want to introduce you, Nicco Reggente. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
Yeah.
Principal investigator and one of the co-founders of an institute that really focuses in Santa Monica, but really focuses more importantly on brain states and extended aspects of consciousness, and his really close collaborator, Leonardo Christov-Moore. And I think both of you kind of are almost like bookends of a big effort going forward into really capturing those. I think they're edges, but I actually think they're core aspects where neuroscience can come in and help us understand, one, what consciousness is, but two, how consciousness operates for our own sort of elevation and improvement and our understanding scientifically. So I want to turn it over to you, Leo, if that's okay. And if you can give a
Sure.
little background on yourself, that would be
Mhm.
awesome.
Hi, so I'm Leonardo Christov-Moore. I'm currently a co-investigator at the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies, and I would say if I were to define my research direction briefly, I'm interested in the way that uh, basic systems interact together to cause larger scale phenomena like consciousness or prosociality, trust, empathy, these very, high level human intelligible things. How do those emerge from more basic systems? Because I personally think that, we are systems made of systems that arise from sort of self-organizing, entropy-defying processes that emerge from, the laws of nature, right? And so it's very interesting. I don't think that demystifies anything. I think it makes it more interesting to examine how do these highly complex processes naturally self-organize and emerge from more basic ones. And so that's led me to understand the self-other boundary and how that's related to why organisms that are ultimately self-evidencing care for one another and sacrifice themselves for one another, and the ways in which consciousness is distributed and extended among living beings, and also the extent to which we are ultimately systems made of systems, and that we are also take part in larger scale systems than ourselves. And individuality in that sense is kind of a very useful illusion, but a very useful one nonetheless. It shouldn't be discarded. So yeah, and that leads me, of course, to the study of consciousness and the varieties of consciousness, which I think personally is what I find the most interesting. Like what consciousness is, I find less interesting as a general question, and other people are pursuing it. I'm more interested in the varieties of conscious experience and how we can harness them for human flourishing, basically.
And Nicco.
Yeah. Thanks, Rodney, for having us on. I share a lot of similar interests to Leo, as my original background is in philosophy of mind, and I kind of decided early on that the going from the armchair to the bench with philosophy of mind is really cognitive neuroscience, right? So my background's all in cognitive neuroscience, and I guess to kind of tie everything together, the main thread of my research has always been ways in which we can use technology to kind of bridge the gap between the insights that are typically housed in, ivory towers, and turning that into translatable tools and experiences and technology that can make real world meaningful impacts on people. So I've used everything from virtual reality and neuromodulation to machine learning and experiential technology to try and do that. And I've been hyper fascinated on human consciousness, learning and memory, and the ability of specific altered states of consciousness, or specifically non-ordinary experiential states, to confer benefits in people in very meaningful and neuroscientifically underpinned ways. For instance, unraveling canalization or deeply held beliefs, and trying to change that into away from maladaptive behavior to the types of behavior that goes on to actually promote human flourishing. And things like empathy, which is kind of how Leo and I kind of started our research career together, was all focused on empathy. Yeah.
That's
And
interesting.
still
And
is.
it's sort of how I'm getting to know you too.
Mm.
So it's interesting. Maybe for the audience, talk about the institute itself. You know, why you had to form one and what's its purpose.
Sure. Yeah, the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit research institute. And honestly, we pride ourselves on residing at the interface between academic rigor and startup flexibility. And when I say that, I mean, for most people that are getting their PhD or pursuing, some form of graduate education or higher education, at the end of the road, there's usually these two paths, right? It's like it's quite, notorious at this point. You're gonna go into industry and probably do, some either data analysis, especially I'm talking about like psychology or cognitive neuroscience PhDs. Go and do some data analysis or potentially some experimental paradigms like user experience, et cetera, but just typically in an industry setting, or academia, right? And that's always kind of the which one are you going to choose? And IACS was born out of trying to flourish with that restraint and create a third potential path, right? Where you can do the type of research that will be published in high impact peer reviewed publications. You'll be an academic and a scholar, and you'll investigate hyper specific questions and with rigorous tools. With a emphasis on open science. But at the same time, you do not have to necessarily, have whatever type of compass is necessary to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy that typically comes along for the ride with most of these larger institutions. And I have, obviously great love for academia, but parts of science are definitely broken, and we are trying to create a platform in which you can do good, strong science in quick, targeted ways that are specifically focused on the outcomes and finding ways to translate those outcomes into consumer technology and just insights that can be relayed to the average person and make an impact. So that's kind of how ICS was started with that intent.
I mean, I think it's interesting because it parallels to some degree, if not crosses over to the DSci movement. It's open science and DSci. So,
Mhm.
with the frustration of let's say even federal funding and studies that actually sit on a shelf and no one knows how to access the paper and the results, and those are really more of a taxpayer, but also it's really an open science issue, and also some really valid scientific discoveries that actually just end up sitting there, and then a whole range of other researchers come in and actually just basically are doing the same work. So sharing of
Right.
knowledge to enhance and elevate and improve the results of scientific experimentation and methodology is really, really important. So it sounds like you kind of have a sweet spot, so keep it growing.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you
Absolutely.
for recognizing it. Yeah.
Yeah. And also too, I think the other thing I wanted to kind of dig into, kind of where our paths cross, I would say probably two places, though we haven't talked about the first, is sort of that non-normal experience. Okay,
Mhm.
that the experience, it can come in a variety of different ways through meditation, psychedelics, trauma, all kinds of different aspects. But the point is that is part of experience,
Right.
a really crucial part of experience. And I wanted to ask you, from a research perspective, how are you approaching those different sort of levels, from a system standpoint, as you mentioned, Leo, but also really from a research design standpoint?
Well, we are focusing on obviously there are many types of transformative experiences, but there's one in particular which has been referred to as self-transcendence, the term that emerges from nursing literature regarding end of life and what dictates how people approach end of life experiences, but it's since been translated into the wider arena of human meaning making. And self-transcendent experiences can be defined as moments in which one feels a sense of ego dissolution, a sense of connectedness, both with one's authentic self and with the world and with others, and a sense of moral elevation, like a motivation to be more kinder and more compassionate. And it's not like an arbitrary one of many thousands of outcomes that can come from these deep experiences. It's one of the most common. It seems that when we are either through religious ritual or a deep psychedelic trip or a life-changing event like the death of a loved one, one of the most frequent outcomes is that people are reminded of the oneness of everything. They're reminded of the deep connection that they have, of the sort of illusory nature of individuality. And somehow this seems to generally, not always, but generally, very frequently, move people to this other kind of cognitive, behavioral, affective attractor state, so to speak, in the sense that it's persistent and often lasts for the rest of their life or for a very long time, in which they feel just a greater sense of compassion and a desire to act better towards others. And so this has been studied a lot, and one of the issues with it is that it's difficult to reliably elicit, right? Because it happens from these peak experiences or as a result of years of disciplined meditation. So something we've been trying to do is, both from the perspective of hard scientists, we're interested, if you're thinking about, if you think about in the domain of psychiatry, for example, most interventions we use to treat addiction or depression or anxiety, you need to come in week after week after week to achieve short, gradual, progressive change, right? So, and that's, in part because we know that the brain and the body are these very complex systems with lots of different weighted connections. It takes a long time to shift a system that complex towards other states because it's motivated to maintain homeostasis. So the fact that there are experiences out there that don't even have to involve a chemical, that can cause that entire system to shift to this whole other attractor state, sometimes for the rest of its life, even from a purely physicalist perspective, that is a remarkable phenomenon, right? And so we're trying to figure out, are there ways to reliably elicit it? And in the process, learn more about the fundamental mechanisms underlying these experiences. And also importantly, speaking to the motivation Nicco mentioned, to democratize these experiences. Because, take the example of psychedelics. Psychedelics are a revolution, or the fact that they're returning to the fore is a revolution. It's wonderful, but they're not a panacea. There are many people for whom their use is contraindicated, and they're very unwieldy. So that excludes a lot of people who might benefit from this type of experience. And similarly, the barriers to entry to meditation and the ideological barriers to entry to a lot of religions, right? So we're trying to create experiences that can democratize and also prove as a forward test of our neuroscientific theories, the basis of these transformative experiences. And that's the subject of much of our current work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just to quickly add to that, I think it was Julius Caesar who said that the experience is the teacher of all things, right?
Yeah.
But the Buddha says that it's one's capacity for experience that is the true teacher. Yeah. So, and to Leo's point, right, is the potency of experience can be transformative for all of these number of reasons. However, access to such experiential states is not democratized yet, right? Like Leo was saying, meditation takes a long time to attain those states. Psychedelics, right, which offer a fast path to some insights, can usually come along with these social, cultural, pharmacological contraindications that prevent people from accessing it. So a big part of our mission is to understand these experiences from the neuroscientific level. Like at the end of the day, we're just endlessly curious and interested in how the brain works. Like that'll never leave us. But we also have this practical component of how can we take what we know about these experiences and not distill it, not take it out of its context, not remove the ritual from it, and not just try to turn it into a little experience pill you can take, right? Really grounding it in the current situation and try to identify what are all the contributing factors, like what are the eigen components of these experience, and how can we use that to our advantage to not just be able to provide a safe experience, but operationalized in such a way that the intent and outcomes can be surgically focused, right? Like, if someone wants to work on one aspect of their maladaptive schemas that they're carrying around, we can zone in on that, right? And create an experience that specifically speaks to that. So a big thread throughout all of this as well is the notion of personalization. And you can't really personalize something until you know all the constituent components involved and when people need more of and what people need less of for a particular experience.
A couple of things that come to mind, and I'd like perhaps if you can share a little bit of the research design here in order to achieve, in other words, to bring the experience in the wild into the laboratory that you're describing. But the other thing that comes to mind is, as you further the scientific sort of method in capturing these different states and interpreting these states, as you disseminate that to people out in the world, not just scientists, beyond scientists, I think one of the benefits is that people feel less alienated when they have these experiences.
Right.
You know, it's so, so there's a lot of people that do this, feel this, have this.
Right.
And I think that sense of alienation when you've been sort of struck by lightning, um, literally, but I'm saying, you know, metaphorically, is something that is very, very difficult to handle for most people. And so
Right.
your work can have that sort of dimension to it as well, meaning helpful dimension.
Yeah. When we're all, and to Nico's point, we're not just interested in the experiences, we're interested also in the scientifically disentangling the factors of set and setting, which is another way of saying looking at the role of belief and expectation, right? So a lot of our theoretical and soon to be empirical work deals with the science of placebo, which is not that we think placebo is the only thing. It's one instance of the role of belief. And so we are going to be studying how beliefs become translated into bodily states. And then after the experience, I think there's going to be a lot of work done on the science of integration, like what dictates successful integration of a belief change after the fact, and figuring out how do we, importantly, how do we also figure out comfortable and relaxing and fun ways for people to report on their experience that aren't just a series of questionnaires? How do we find implicit measures, which is something I was actually talking about this weekend at this event for Sensoria with our colleague Cody Gibbons on how to use AI tools to parse people's naturalistic talks about their experience afterwards to extract richer information than we actually might get from traditional questionnaires. So we're putting a lot of work into all the different aspects of a trip, not just the experience itself.
Yeah, you're finding a lot of work that might dovetail into what you're describing right now in capturing eye movement, facial cues, and
Exactly.
presentation. All of those things that are really, really important to really understand the kind of sentience and also the moods of people. It's being used in autism. It's used in a lot of different, but it's used diagnostically as well as. So you have a lot to build on there. I think there's some rich technology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, the key is we do have to get first the ground truth by training it on people using these long form questionnaires, but that's a tractable problem, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very exciting. Very exciting. One thing I wanted to ask, perhaps really both of you, is the idea of empathy. Could we circle around that a bit more, or at least start to? Because to me, the paper on preventing sociopathic robots. First of all, it's a great title, everyone. Just letting you know. That's a goodie. But the underlying writing and approach and some of the framework that you set down there is really important for our moment in generative AI and issues of safety in particular and alignment. So for me, the idea of being able to establish robots that actually have some sort of form of representation of harm, and therefore they have some form of representation that allows them to picture potential harm that they would cause in others, is really important. It seems novel, and it's so natural to humans that we don't even unpack it.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit, kind of the inception of the project itself, and kind of where you see that work going today, and why you think it's important.
Well, as you mentioned, I think that people take for granted some of the affective, visceral, felt aspect of empathy, and think of empathy just as a process of understanding. And you can see this blind spot reflected in much of the very well-intentioned efforts in the field to try to use artificial empathy to, avoid the worst outcomes in AI, in especially in future general AI. And this came to my attention when I was kind of casting around. I was interested in writing about artificial empathy, following from some of the soft robotics work of Antonio Damasio, who I was working with along with others, like Kingston Mann and Jonas Kaplan at USC's Brain and Creativity Institute. And what I noticed, most of what was out there was not papers, but rather talks, like lectures and different things. And I noticed that one after another, everyone was talking about, yes, we're going to do artificial empathy. We're going to teach them to understand us and teach them to behave in ways that make us feel at ease. And I was listening to that thinking, as an empathy scientist, this is what I've studied for 10 years. I was sitting there thinking, entities that are super intelligent, that can decode us and can evince responses that make us feel at ease. That sounds like a sociopath. That sounds like an expert manipulator. That doesn't sound like an empathic agent at all. It's because there's no felt component. There's nothing to intrinsically motivate them to avoid harming us or anything like that. So that prompted the writing of that paper. And 2 years later, we had kind of done the work of really sussing it out. We talked with a lot of roboticists in terms of how to translate into something tractable. And thankfully now, thanks to the Survival and Flourishing Fund, we're actually implementing some of those ideas using simulations with our collaborators Guillaume Dumas and Adam Safran and our student Zara Sheikh-Baheh. So that's sort of the inception of the work. It was an empathy scientist horrorized reaction at some of the well-meaning attempts going on in the field.
From a more of a philosophical historian point of view, Yuval Harari said that it's not so much what we should be concerned about, what AI will do to us, but how AI will elicit a level of empathy. I'm sorry, a level of intimacy and empathy.
Yes.
So in other words, it's shifting the relationship and we won't even see it.
Exactly.
So it's to your point, and he's super concerned about that.
Yeah.
It's like you can make these safe bots, but at the same time, they're really re-engineering the notion of intimacy and empathy as they become smarter. So
absolutely.
it's
could quickly have ripple effects.
Different perspective, but I think there's a lot of people out there, including myself, that are concerned about this area.
Right. Yeah, and it's important. I mean, another area in which it's important is that as these tools become widely integrated, it's going to be crucial that people trust them, because more and more of their welfare is going to be in their hands. And so part of trusting is that people need to have actual physical, evidence and demonstrations that these entities actually have some regard for their welfare, that they can understand that. I think one of the ways that can happen, where the ways that can be a common ground, is if these agents are vulnerable, which is what in the paper we consider is the first step. You have to experience vulnerability in order to feel for and understand the vulnerability of others. And I think that a vulnerable agent that sort of demonstrates self-sacrifice despite its own vulnerability will be something much more worthy of our trust than something that has no skin in the game. So I think as there start to be something like AI human relations, it will be important that we have that common ground in vulnerability.
Very, very interesting. And you know that Jonas was on this podcast too, right?
Really? That's great. He's amazing.
Yeah. And we talked quite a bit about this area. And the not the way that you and Nicco are talking about it, though. That's for sure. I think the one thing that's super crucial here is to really understand how AI would understand vulnerability, because really the human ultimate vulnerability is our perishing, our death, right? It's it could be social death or it could be physical death. Some aspect of that is coded into our survival and our sense of vulnerability. We feel deeply, I'm talking about at that ultimate end, that there's something very threatening, and that would be the ultimate harm. And how to kind of code that into robots, I'm not asking for an answer here, but I'm just saying that is something to think about. A robot would have to feel vulnerable, and that the ultimate punishment is their non-existence.
Right. Well, I think that non-existence,
if they care about it, they have to care about not existing.
Yeah, it's true. Well, I think that caring about non-existing, just as it does with us, arises from vulnerability, in the sense that we can experience harm, we can experience diminishment, and we can experience aging and change. And at some point, every human, basically extrapolates that outward to what could be. And it's the what could be, because we don't know what death is like. It's the what could be that really gives us pause. And I don't think it's too poetic to think that an agent of sufficient complexity that has experienced vulnerability could basically plot the derivative of that and see, well, this can come a point at which the I am undefined, and that actually might be a profound moment for an agent like that, right? There is a what happens when this line hits this intercept, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's cool to see how it, kind of leads to seemingly counterintuitive considerations for, a hardware manufacturing, right? It's like if you're building something, right, like a robot that's going to take, X amount of dollars in research and development, the natural inclination would be build something that's very strong and robust and, kind of like these Boston Dynamics type robots where it's like we got to protect the investment, put as much as possible into it. And like, to a certain degree, natural evolution has done that with, protecting our brain, right? It's the most powerful instrument we know of in the universe, and it's pretty well protected, but not terribly so. But by taking a specific stance in the actual construction to create some form of vulnerability, and maybe not in our traditional understanding of like tangible vulnerability, but more so in something that can actually affect its compute power, right? Its ability to perform the tasks which is being assessed.
Next up, the Oxnard. Next up, Oxnard. We want to give a special.
Which is very different than which is actually very similar in a lot of ways to the way you would train traditional machine learning, right? There's there's penalty parameters, etc. It's just kind of slightly changing the locus of that penalty parameter to be more so on the actual capacity with which to do the computation in the first place, right? Which actually has this interesting like trickle down effect that causes, actually results in better performance than a traditional penalty penalty parameter, which is like what some of this work was initially based on. Do you know if that work is out yet, Leo? I know we talked with Kingston and the Kingston and Hartmut paper.
I know it's at least in archive. I know it's at least in
Yeah,
archive.
I know it's on the
that
archive.
people
I
can
just don't know
see
if
it.
it came out yet.
I would need to check. I suspect it has, but yeah, I could follow
Really
up on
inspired work that like kind of does a computational assessment of this concept, which is very strange. And even the authors almost say like, I'm not quite sure why this is the case, but creating the penalty being on the actual computational power as opposed to like a more conceptual penalty parameter changes the outward performance, which is really kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah,
it's exciting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, essentially that introducing vulnerability doesn't just maybe open the possibility to warm fuzzy robots. It actually makes for algorithms that are better able to adapt dynamically to changing seasons, to changing what's called concept shift. Like if you're optimizing for a problem, but the optimal result is no longer the same one it was at a previous time, a lot of algorithms have a lot of difficulty reshaping themselves to re-optimize to that new set of labels. And a vulnerable neural network actually outperforms most other algorithms in doing that. So there are computational reasons why vulnerability is actually useful, which was an interesting result.
Super interesting. But I'd say kind of one aspect of that is that we're beginning to enter into the multimodal world. Gemini was released and we have OpenAI. And really what that means is that, not to mention that all the outputs can be text and image and video and pulled from a million different sources to achieve those particular images and text and paragraphs. But that you're actually constantly transforming that data. And so the adaptability that's built into the larger foundation models is super important to what you're saying. It's not just training data and then multiple sets of training data. You're talking about sources of data that are millionfold that are coming in and being transformed. And so adaptability is really core to that model, or I should say that new push in generative AI. Where the papers are on that, I'm not sure. I know that is true, but given your work, it's something to explore.
You're muted, buddy. Sorry. You're still muted. Yeah, sorry.
If you're interested, there's some work from our collaborator Casper Hess has a similar approach to affect, basically reading affect, something like feeling or emotion as a deep layer of inference, which is essentially tracking the overall fitness of the model itself. So it can, integrating a level like that is, again, drawing inspiration from biological systems, has been shown to also increase the adaptability of a system, right? That having something like affect, which is, again, super interesting findings drawn from biological inspiration. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, now that as we're getting further in the discussion, you know, adaptability is really one of the core strengths of vulnerability. Or I should say that one of the core outcomes, you know, I don't call it a strength. But also, what other aspects of vulnerability could one envision when thinking about artificial empathy? Is it of course, the ability to picture and understand harm, but harm to one and harm to others? But does harm to others impact my vulnerability? In other words, if I have a community of people, a community of robots that I depend on, and I injure them, where does my community go? Where's my support?
Right.
I don't know how that gets sort of inferred into your work, but often we have an impact not just on our family, our friends, that might be negative, but we can have a larger impact that can be not positive. And so I'm just wondering, is it a one-to-one relationship so far that you're thinking about in terms of empathy?
Well, I think the way we're envisioning it, at least in this very basic guidelines parameter, from the perspective of neuroscientists, right? We're not roboticists ourselves, is that once you've trained an agent to be able to both maximize its own, physical integrity in the world over time, and you've trained it to also learn to perceive and model when other agents, the state of other agents' physical state or vulnerability in the world, you then have the third stage, which is, you put this agent back into the world with other agents. And now, much as there is with humans and other social animals, you introduce a blurring between their running assessment of their welfare and their projected welfare following a given decision, is combined with the projected welfare of other agents involved to a weighted extent, right? You could envision that a firefighter robot might need to have a higher weight put on the welfare of other agents versus their own, because they need to be able to undertake decisions that harm themselves. Same with a bodyguard. But then you might envision a robot that, for example, whose persistence in the world was necessary for the large-scale survival of a colony, right? Like an irrigation robot, that it might need to weight the welfare of other agents differently relative to its own, which starts to become something akin to utilitarian moral reasoning, right? So a lot of these things could emerge just from differently weighted blurring of the projected and current welfare of the agent with that of others, which I think is how it works with us too. Like we attribute others to ourselves to a greater or lesser extent, right?
Yeah, and I don't necessarily see that because I know in your paper you refer to bias here, and the scaling of bias could be a negative.
Right.
We bias our family even when our family is not so great to us.
Right. Yeah.
We bias a lot of people that if you objectively stand back, it seems that the particular care you're exhibiting towards that person or group seems unjustified. So when you talk about weighting, I'm hearing this idea that you would weight different people in a certain kind of social order in a way in which their current concerns would be different than others. So you have to sort of segment that out. I'm wondering how that gets done, though. I'm not asking for all the nuts and bolts here, but I'm just wondering, like a firefighter versus a nurse versus, maybe someone that's homeless versus the guy next door, like how you think about that, how one would think about that in terms of weighting.
Right.
I don't know. And maybe there's a generic robot that. Go ahead.
So sorry, that was his he's on the train, so the alarm.
Oh, I'm sorry, that was someone else talking.
Yeah, but no, I mean, to your point, like, yeah, Leo and I were. I don't think the figures made it into the final paper, but we were kind of thinking about the appropriateness of different types of robots at different for different contexts, and specifically the variable at play there is the time scale that's considered, right? And almost, you start getting into like utilitarian territory. Is like, okay, well, how much harm is being caused at this moment, but specifically at what time scales, right? And that's where things like, the alignment problem really start coming into play, because it's like, oh, well, something that's maximally beneficial right now, but could cause, extinction, of a large swath of the human population, but, down the road, it's a net good. Is that still good, right? So we did some thinking about that, but I just kind of wanted to seed it because obviously Leo's far more versed on this topic, but we did think about it, like a robot that would be good as let's say like a bodyguard, right, versus a firefighter robot versus a police officer, and like what that means and how you'd have to adjust these parameters and change preservation of self versus others versus, and specifically with consideration of the time scale. I know I'm probably butchering it slightly, Leo, but I wanted to give that to you as like a launch pad of some of the considerations we've found.
Yeah, no, you're right. Part of it is you could imagine different use cases where the self versus other weighting were different. And then, yeah, of course, something that affective processes or proxies for affect allow us to do is to integrate the anticipated welfare over many time scales. So just as Nicco was alluding to, you do need an agent that doesn't simply have one estimation of welfare for a given decision, because you have to take into account that, like you said, something harmful now may have a benefit down the line, and something beneficial now may have a long-term harm. So part of the way an agent would need to do this is integrate, as humans do, over many different timescales. And what this leads to, is one of the other considerations we make in the paper in terms of a hopeful outcome, which is that if we're successful in creating an agent that is able to exercise sort of projected vulnerability and some proxy for compassion into its decisions, it might allow for agents that can overcome one of the central shortcomings of human empathy, which is, like you say, bias. Our empathy is biased, and our empathy is short-sighted frequently, and importantly, we have difficulty modeling more than a few agents at once, right? There's the sort of the Dunbar's number. We have a lot of difficulty thinking about situations that involve large number of agents at the same time in the same way that we would considerations among a small tribe. And so that particular point is one in which AI could greatly supersede us. So you could imagine a kind of resource distribution or conflict mediation agent that was able to actually engineer or propose compassionate solutions to large-scale problems, where it still is taking into account the individual welfare of each person. It doesn't abstract or turn suffering into a statistic the way even us, we much vaunted compassionate beings do. So there are actually ways in which an empathic artificial agent might not just equal us, but supersede us in certain use cases, which I think is, a very hopeful possibility.
And so in this case, I think we're talking almost primarily on the behavioral side, right? So
yeah,
those would be all the cues that would be enough for that agent to make empathic decisions, correct? And or that robot.
Right.
So internal states could not be determined.
Well, internals, I mean, we personally can't determine internal states either. We infer them.
The philosophy of mind problem, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so you're still making the whole point of the second stage of the three-stage kind of guidelines we outline is one of the main things an agent has to learn to do is infer the internal status of another agent merely from the external representation, as much as we do, right? That's the same thing we have to do, right?
Right.
And they might even be able to do a better job, given that you could imagine them tracking, being able to do thermal imaging, track someone's heart rate. They might be able to pick up on things that most humans can't even do. Mm-hmm. So we might get some really fine grained assessments of welfare. And I mean, the real question then becomes, how do we trust the solutions created by these agents? They might propose incredibly counterintuitive solutions to large scale problems that just evade our intuition. So there's going to be a certain amount of trust involved in some of these cases. It's going to be very interesting.
And also experimentation outside the lab. So there'll have to be, kind of a different understanding, or maybe a research design where robots are a little bit more in the wild, or at least interacting.
Yeah.
Do you see that going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think it's pertinent to try and look at these things in simulation first. Like, do we observe proto-ethical behavior emerge naturally across a large range of scenarios? And when given the option or the possibility to take a very damaging decision, do they avoid it 100% of the time? Right? Like kind of like provide artificial temptations. And then, yeah, you'd have to be very careful about testing that in the wild, so to speak. So, you could imagine it first being tested, maybe even just colonies of agents interacting with one another, right? They shouldn't favor a human over artificial. You should still see them behave ethically with one another. So you might have a robot island, see what happens there. There's a lot of possibilities.
I'm going to take half a step back, because I think it's important, because what we're talking about, to me, given the accelerated pace of our larger models, seems, I could say, on one level, a little too late, or it's the timing is absolutely critical and urgently and on time. And I say this is that these concepts are so foundational from the ground level up, to be coding in and understanding empathic responses, being very computationally driven in issues around vulnerability, really being able to capture the sort of nuance of facial cues and so forth. And can this be done sort of retroactively? I guess we don't have an answer for that, but it seems these are not, like, for example, Anthropic is building principles into their chatbot. They have close to $10 billion of investment as an answer to OpenAI's accelerated, let's just get it out in their hands approach. And so let's say that OpenAI approaches you and says, can you help us create empathic chatbots?
Right.
There's so much work done already, and they're on the verge of AGI, that how can you reverse engineer back into, and this is not an analytics platform put on top of, this is something very foundational. I don't have an answer. I'm just sort of talking with you, because I feel that this is work, not that you should have done it or anyone, but that it feels that this should have been conceptualized 10 years ago and started part of the engineering community's sort of mandate. So are you in conversations with any of these companies? Are you thinking about how this could actually be deployed in any way into these larger models? Or you're just on your case with the research, which is you have to stay on your case. I'm just saying. Because because you have this, I think, really important open science approach, this work needs to actually get deployed.
Right.
And it needs to have an open application approach, so that it actually gets into systems, not as a trickle in, but as foundational. So I don't know if that changes your thinking or informs your thinking at all, but that's what I see. This is not a one-off. These are not one-off research projects.
No, not at all. I mean, I think we just started on actually applying these to simulation. I think if this next stage can be successful, I think there will be considerable attention to how to maybe modularize and implement this as simply like one stage of a training curriculum. Maybe it's just the case that, if you to draw a parallel to to draw a parallel to Greek mythology or even Semitic mythology, at a certain point, often the training of a god or a king involves being put into human form and thrown onto the street, right, to experience vulnerability and pain and suffering. And then then they become immortal again, but they have to experience it. It's part of what makes them just and wise. And you could imagine an analog for AI, even if it's a disembodied LLM. Maybe there are benefits to be obtained by momentarily embodying it with something vulnerable and like showing it what it's like to have skin in the game. And I'm speaking poetically, but I don't think these are entirely impossible ideas, right? And they might really be useful. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I don't know, Nicco, if that's something you've thought about as well.
Yeah, not terribly, but that's it's a great concept. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about this.
We'll see.
Yeah, I want to ask, because you're touching on this concept, and it's more than a concept, it's sort of a way of practice, I think, is cognitive neuroscience below the neck.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm a fan of Andy Clark and study with Marcel Kinsborn and a number of folks that were cognitive psychologists and cognitively oriented. But the issue of embodiment was super important to the way they saw the brain and mind's sort of relationship. So do you see your work overall kind of fitting in that embodied kind of approach, or, and maybe just define what is neuroscience below the neck as opposed to above the neck?
Right.
Sorry to be so crude, but it's an interesting concept.
No, it's well phrased. What do you think, Nicco? You want to give that a stab?
Yeah. I mean, it's there has been permeating throughout cognitive neuroscience this, elitism for that which is above the neck, almost as if we've forgotten the fact that I'm touching neurons right now, and like there's a whole peripheral nervous system, there's an interoceptive nervous system. However, everybody's mostly, and with a whole case of justification behind it, obsessed with brain mapping, right? And not necessarily appreciating the extent to which that is actually distributed throughout the body. And a lot of our work that Leo has championed, along with some other great thinkers like Alex Diamant, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Adam Safran and other people here, around actually trying to meet neuroscience where it is, right, and trying to tap into some of these, leading theories like the free energy principle and active inference, and deep parametric allostasis, and trying to find, okay, what could some computational substrates of that entail, and is there a position for that in the peripheral and interoceptive nervous systems? And a lot of our work has been trying to, or a lot of our theoretical work has been trying to map that, right, and say, oh, well, this can happen in the body, right? And then you start opening up the doors to, like Leo was leading with before, around the profound ways in which we already know that belief impacts the body. For instance, the placebo effect, right? This massive effect that's kind of almost demonized in most settings, and it deserves a little bit of a flipping of the script to say, hey, this is something we should lean into. This is a powerful phenomenon that's, equating with these, pharmacological agents in a lot of cases, and making real meaningful change. And, how else can that connect to the idea, of psychosomatics and somatic therapy, and how, releasing tension in the body can cause, mental stress relief, and vice versa. So yeah, I think it's a long overdue discussion. And as Leo says, a lot of it is really just like vestiges of Cartesian thinking, of these traditional, dualist perspectives. And again, I think really grounding it in these potential substrates to conduce these phenomena is a crucial first step.
Yeah, I think it's very crucial. I had last week on the podcast Jeffrey Krippel, and he talks extensively. He's sort of the humanities side of both of you.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and he wrote a book recently called The Superhumanities that he actually is starting to talk about. But he also wrote the book called The Flip, and it's scientists that actually flipped, not directly in the way that either one of you have, but really understand experience from a much more wider perspective, such as from trauma, near-death experience, psychedelics. And then he goes back into history to find, the different scientific thinkers that actually most of their innovations came from, not from a cognitive place, but from some other place that was from an exceptional experience they had. And maybe not directly that they had some sort of light bulb moment, though he does call it epiphanies. But he really, I'll say he's one of the brethren here of what you're doing in neuroscience, he's doing in the humanities, to kind of get us to think about, not only human experience in a more dimensional fashion, but the fallacy of doing the kinds of work that you're doing, in which phenomena is only, how can I say, it is only done in a very sterile lab setting. that you need to kind of open up the way in which that phenomenon can be captured and elicited. And he has some thoughts on that, and why much of this work has not actually gone forward is the kind of the white coat problem, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
I'm just throwing things out at you. These
no,
aren't,
yeah, that's to that
just,
point. It's really about getting that toehold and getting the traction, and some of the thinking around it. Like, even though we've done this theoretical thinking about the potential computational substrates, or the substrates for computation, we're also trying to think about different types of phenomena that are overlooked from this particular angle, right? So, for instance, the phenomenon of aesthetic chills, right, is a really interesting phenomenon to look at, because it kind of resides at this interface between cognition and interoception and somatosensory processes in ways that's like reutilizing some of our most basic and primal features of our physiology, right? The shiver response and piloerection, right? Getting goosebumps. These are things that are very important for our thermoregulation, which is arguably, as warm-blooded creatures, one of the most important things we engage in, right? It's promoting homeostasis. So why is it, right, that something that's purely aesthetic can recruit this system, right? Is it because there's such a profound need to propagate and update in beliefs throughout the entire body, such that every node in the system is being touched and felt? And is it an information erasure and reconfiguration that needs to dispel heat? We don't know, but it's a very interesting phenomenon, and I think a place where we can really get a toehold, right? Because it's something that everybody's experienced, right? Is replicable. We can study in the lab. A large part of our work now is dedicated towards understanding what gives chills to certain types of people, revealing what it can mean on a psychological level, and then collecting data in the lab so we understand the neurophysiological underpinnings of the experience and how it can actually, open you up and create very hyper salient updates to the way you see the world, or i.e., untrench your beliefs. So something like that, right? Taking that type of calculated approach where it's like, okay, here's something that, no one's going to deny the existence of, but maybe haven't thought about from that type of angle or that pitch that I kind of just surmised there. I think things like that are where the change starts to happen, right? That's where the cracks are and where we can really, stand to make a difference if we position it and we do strong, good, rigorous science, everything that we're trying to do here. Yeah. We can't have an interview without talking about chills anymore at this level.
But I think we're circling around something really important, is how to elicit those phenomena, those taken for granted phenomena, right?
Yeah.
And
right.
how you and Leo and your team is thinking through this. So it sounds to me a couple things. One is that you're continuing to explore what phenomena there is, and two, you've latched onto and really and designing research protocols for those that you're already working on. And I think the third thing, though, is that you recognize that there's a lot of human experience that you actually want to capture that isn't hardly ever captured in a laboratory setting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where
exactly.
simulation comes in really helpful, right?
Mm-hmm.
To some degree.
Yeah. Especially with the crowd. But yeah, I mean, grounding things in both, it's a shame because sometimes in science, the minute you begin to observe something is the very time that it's not the thing that you're looking for, right? It's our very own observer phenomenon. Neuroscience has grown up, right, to physics, early physics level. However, there are ways in which we can try and study these things kind of in situ, right, as they are, and try to design experiments that actually have real world applications and aren't necessarily, just siloed ivory tower style where it's just making sense and self-serving inside of its own cluster. And a lot of this has been spearheaded, or a lot of this thinking is spearheaded by Leo, on designing real world pro-social games, right, where we're trying to move the needle on empathic concern, right? And sure, we can give you some questionnaires about how empathic you are and have you do maybe some like simple tasks, but Leo, together with sorry, I don't know the name, but with some neuroeconomists, and some of his past work at UCLA has been towards designing real world games with real world implications, right? So for instance, one of our studies here where we're providing participants with chills eliciting stimuli that we verified in a past set of studies, trying to give them the experience in the lab, we're then seeing the degree to which that will change the amount of charitable giving they engage in, but in a very real way, right? We spend a lot of time collecting real people in Los Angeles, right? Recruiting them, getting their socioeconomic status, getting their profile, a little bit about them, so that we can create like an avatar for them. So when people come in, we give them $100 and we say, hey, this is all yours, but do this computer game in this room away from you. It's completely anonymized. There's no way we can trace it back to you, right? You're operating completely of your own volition. This way, we're not incentivizing them in any capacity. They have no good reason other than, true care or wanting to assist to give any of that money to anybody else. So we show them, oh, do you want to give Bob from Burbank, who's a janitor and makes $36,000? Do you want to give him 10 of the $100 we just gave you, or 5 of the $100 we gave you? What about Allison in Culver City, who's a lawyer that makes $200K a year? How much do you want to give to them? And then this is real money then, right? We actually have to then go out. We have all the banking information of everybody. We go out, we actually distribute those funds, right? So what is that getting at, right? That's getting at this truly ecologically valid assessment of one's empathic concern, especially as it relates to their own socioeconomic status of others. And you can derive all of these neat metrics out of it. But you're taking something, right, that's normally sterilized and isolating this experience, and we're giving people this experience that typically comes accompanied with self-transcendence, and we're able to do it in the lab in a careful set of ways, but then also actually measure the real world implications of that, right? Like if we give people these experiences, if we give policymakers these types of experiences, if we give people who are in charge of budgets, right, specifically to lower SES locations, can we make a difference, right? Can we move that needle? That's typically kind of a trait metric, right? It remains pretty static over time. If we can take a neuroscientific approach to providing experiences that permit for belief updating in such a way that it actually impacts charitable giving, I think you can actually, start that can be a potential fulcrum point to maximize human flourishing, right? Because it's not just a one-to-one thing, right? It's like if you affect one person's capacity for empathy, you're now impacting the people they come in contact with as well, right? So the potential for virality is there. I'd be curious to see what what is it in true virality of pathogens? It's like the R factor, right?
Right, the R factor, yeah.
Like I'd be curious what the R factor of like that little mind virus is. But yeah, yeah.
Super interesting. And you and Leo have used this word flourishing, human flourishing, quite a few times. And so that I just want to underscore that's quite a bit different than a lot of research organizations. Their idea is to capture the research and publish it, often paywalled. And you actually have this kind of extra, I think, extra sort of agenda is that some of your research would actually promote human flourishing.
Right.
And you're looking for those pivot areas or those fulcrum areas in which that can occur. Is that true?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're attendant to that, and we're attendant to when we think about even how we communicate our work. For example, anything we publish, we try to also publish a lay version of it, which currently we do through our site's blog, but we want to expand to publishing in places like The Atlantic, like Aeon. We want anything we produce to be understandable without sacrificing rigor to as many people as possible. And then interventions we make, media that we produce, stimuli that we make, we want to be publicly available and, if possible, incorporated into pedagogy, public policy messaging, at no cost to the person doing it. So if we sense that there's a tangible outcome to be achieved from what we make, we want to make sure that it's freely available. Which is frequently meant turning down or having to stand fairly firm when people approach us about monetizing aspects of our research, and it's just kind of like, Yeah, we're down to offer you a first mover advantage, maybe 6 months, but everyone's going to know about this and everyone can use it. Sorry,
Yeah,
this is how it goes.
that's in our that's in our DNA. Seriously,
Yeah.
open source is in our DNA. I've done several for-profit entrepreneurial ventures. I know that ship and it has its merits, but in this case where we're trying to, unveil, an understanding of ourselves and society and our brain and how that can promote human flourishing, the only place for money in that equation, in my opinion, is the philanthropy to support the work, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, get it out of here.
Yeah.
Open source to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. And certainly getting to know you both, I could not agree with you more. But I think our audience may want to get a little more on this one. And that is, what is the negative of having VCs come in? Like, how would that change the human flourishing direction? And I mean, it's all speculative, and I've certainly been involved in entrepreneurial activities, so I have an answer for it, but I just wanted to get a sense from you guys. You're super firm on your model, on your on your nonprofit model, and you're super firm on open sourcing your research and being clear about it to different levels of people, expertise. Tell me, like, a group of VCs says, here you are. And what would happen if how would it change your research?
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, that's a boring question because you've already discussed this so many times.
Yeah,
no, it's something we've been thinking about a lot lately and talking with other people about. So it's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the devil's in the details, right? It depends on what the intent is and what the product is and what the population that they're seeking is, right? Like some things that, Leo has been thinking about recently is, making things that are, self-transcendent and flourishing, kind of totally free, and other things, some pay to play if it were in a VC model. But to be honest with you, we've kind of been in situations like that where we've been approached and we just say pass, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't necessarily want to encourage that type of future. I do think that it's important to align ourselves with individuals who are strategic and could help support the work, and then be able to, as Leo was saying, have a first mover advantage on monetizing some of the IP that comes out. And that's more so to mitigate the concerns of this spreading as an informational hazard, right? Like there is something, right, where we need to be cautious around making everything open source right away, as opposed to kind of taking that open AI approach, right? Where yes, they do want to make it open source and available to people, but they want to make sure that they're the leaders first so they can control the narrative and make sure it's not being used to, create a bunch of designer pathogens using a strange combination of things around the house, right? It's an informational hazard, much in the same way, right? Where we're focused on creating hyper plastic or highly entropic states that we can then, help create or help guide people or help allow people be attracted to this pro-social behavior. The same concept can kind of go to more, negative outcomes, right? Like blind allegiance to an authority figure, right? Or it's, it could be used in what some may call like a brainwashing fashion, right? So we need to be very careful about that. And, I feel like that somewhat ties into the monetization element, because when monetization is involved, right, there's this distillation to that bottom line, right, of like, oh, once there's stakeholders that are investing just for return on their investment, the narrative changes slightly, or not slightly, dramatic, right? In that, maybe it's most beneficial to, create these experiences that then go on to increase engagement on a platform, right? Like all of Silicon Valley is obsessed with like daily active users and how active those users are. It's like, it's just those metrics of engagement, but it's like, well, what kind of engagement is it? Is it meaningful? Is it enriching? Is it just literally a dopamine hit over and over again? Are we becoming rats on the lever? Right. And that's a byproduct, in my opinion, of focusing on that bottom line, right? When your barometer for success is purely profit, right? Not saying that all companies are like that, but when you tend to shift your locus of focus there, it usually begets some of these, like, kind of really negative pimples that bubble up on the surface of the whole machine, right? So we'd want to kind of avoid that and dodge that by aligning with people that aren't necessarily investing in us, but can do their own thing with it, but are aligned with us in such a way that they can support the work and potentially receive some of the IP from it, in a trusted way, something that kind of aligns with our values and morals.
Yeah, and also, I mean, a lot of the tool, the way we interact with private entities, rationales that can allow them to get greater insight on the things that they're providing. So that's using something open source just in a way that we maybe know how to use the best, or that we're the most trusted people to apply some of those tools. For example, we are in the process of figuring out ways to work with people who are looking to figure out how to produce media that creates engagement, but engagement that is like uplifting and creates long-term joy states and not simply these short dopamine bursts. And so aesthetic chills is a really interesting way to optimize for that. So we're looking into people who are doing, story building for video games and things along those lines. And in that case, that's an open, that's an open use of an open source thing. But what we're being engaged on is in the basis of our expertise. And then something that we've been talking about with different people who are sort of adjacent to the private sector and the VC kind of domain is, what are some of the ways that we can frame the incentives for people to do more like impact funding of the research without necessarily expecting a traditional return on investment? And some of those is, something as traditional as just providing cocktail party fodder and, status for them. Obviously, it's being part of the scientific endeavor is, I think an amazing thing. And then also, a return to some of the old motivations for patronage for the older, the artists of the Renaissance, for example, which is simply producing a lasting legacy and producing things that create awe in people. And, we'd like to think that there are people out there of means who are interested in having an impact beyond simply a return on their own investment. People thinking about the welfare of humans beyond their own time scale, right? And encouraging thinking about flourishing and well-being on these longer term scales, which I think involves promoting work for which there isn't always necessarily a direct benefit, but which human knowledge and human meaning making is improved. We are somewhat trusting it that there are truly noble impulses in people of means, right? It's not just about returning on investment in the next quarter. So there's a bit of a trust game on our end as well.
There are. It's just aligning with them for sure.
Yes, exactly.
I think we have overall we have some existential problems that I think people with means are helping to solve, and people are starting to step out more and more to realize that the future is something they're investing in, not just a return on investment for the next quarter. I cannot tell you a bigger thanks to both of you.
Thank you so much.
It's such a great conversation, and there's so much more to talk about. So I hope we have more conversations. I would like that, and in the
that would be great
towards flourishing.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for having us, Rodney, and for seeing us. It always feels good to be seen, especially when we're kind of like fighting this fight that's not everybody totally understands what we're trying to do. It's not quite radical yet, but it's definitely on the road to being something that could be revolutionary. You get a bunch of strange looks in the beginning of that, right? So it feels very nice to be seen, and appreciated. So thank you.
Thank
you so much, Rob.
No strange looks. I just strongly feel that where were you like 10 years ago? So, but that's not a criticism. It's just like there's a lot of good work to be done now. Yeah.
Exactly.
I feel you. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, thank you. More to come. More conversations. Talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Enjoy your train ride, Leo.
Thank you. Sorry for the noise.
Okay.
Good one.